There is a room beneath Buckingham Palace that most people will never see. A vault lined in velvet, humming with the quiet weight of centuries. Inside it sit diamonds that have rested against the throats of queens, pearls that absorbed the tears of princesses, bracelets built from the grief of mothers who lost everything. Every piece in that room tells a story. And Queen Elizabeth II knew every single one of those stories by heart. She also knew something else. She knew that jewelry, in the right hands, is not decoration. It is a declaration. It is a message written in platinum and diamonds that lasts longer than any speech, any announcement, any carefully worded palace statement. And for 17 years, she used that vault to send a message so clear, so deliberate, so utterly precise that it didn't need a single word attached to it. The message was this: the future of this monarchy has a face. And it is not Camilla's. Today we are going inside that vault. We are tracing every piece, every decision, every pointed silence. And by the end, you will understand that what happened between these two women was never really about jewelry at all. It was about legacy, trust, and a queen who decided very early on exactly who she was handing the monarchy to. To understand the jewelry war, you have to understand the battle that started before a single piece was ever open for discussion. April 9, 2005. Charles and Camilla married at Windsor Guildhall in a civil ceremony followed by a blessing at St. George's Chapel. It was, by any measure, a moment that had taken 30 years to arrive. And the moment it did, a question immediately surfaced inside palace corridors that no one quite knew how to answer. What would Camilla be called? Under English constitutional convention, the wife of the Prince of Wales is the Princess of Wales. It is automatic. It is legal. It requires no ceremony, no decree, no special permission. The moment Camilla became Charles's wife, she became, technically, legally, the Princess of Wales. That was Diana's title. It had been Diana's title from the day she married Charles in July 1981 until their divorce in 1996. And even after Diana died in that Paris tunnel in August 1997, the title carried so much of her memory, so much public emotion, that it was practically sacred ground. Palace sources at the time, reported in detail by royal biographer Penny Junor in her work on Charles and Camilla, indicated that there were internal discussions about Camilla's styling. Clarence House announced that Camilla would use the title Duchess of Cornwall rather than Princess of Wales, citing a desire to be sensitive to public feeling. The official explanation was careful and diplomatic. But people who understood how that palace worked understood something more specific was happening. The Queen had drawn a line. Camilla would not wear Diana's name. Not that name. Not that title. Not one syllable of it. The Duchess of Cornwall. It was a perfectly respectable title. It carried genuine historical weight. But it was also a very deliberate signal about exactly where Camilla stood in the architecture of the monarchy. Not at its emotional center. Not in Diana's place. Beside that place, certainly, but never inside it. That decision, made quietly and announced through a brief Clarence House statement, set the template for everything that followed. The Queen had found her instrument. She would use it with extraordinary patience and extraordinary precision for the next 17 years. Before we go any further, it is worth taking a moment to understand what the Royal Jewelry Collection actually is, because most people have no real sense of its scale or its significance. The collection spans centuries. It includes pieces that predate the British Empire, gifts from foreign heads of state, heirlooms passed through generations of royal women, and acquisitions made by monarchs who understood that certain objects carry a country's identity as surely as any flag or constitution. The Royal Collection Trust, which oversees the broader collection, describes it as held in trust by the sovereign for the nation and her successors, meaning no single individual truly owns these pieces. They are custodied, stewarded, and the question of who stewards what is, therefore, one of enormous symbolic consequence. Queen Elizabeth II inherited this responsibility from her father, George VI, who inherited it from his father, George V, and so on in an unbroken line stretching back through centuries of British history. Over her 70-year reign, she became its most knowledgeable living steward. She knew which pieces had diplomatic implications. She knew which pieces carried painful personal histories. She knew which pieces were tied to specific titles, specific occasions, specific women whose memories still echoed through the public's imagination. And she had a system. Her personal dresser, Angela Kelly, who later wrote about her decades with the Queen in her memoir, The Other Side of the Coin, managed the physical logistics of the vault with exacting care. Every piece that left that vault was logged. Every request, from any member of the royal family, was processed through a formal approval structure. Nothing was casual. Nothing was accidental. The Queen was involved in every significant decision about who wore what and when. This is the system Camilla walked into in 2005. And what she could not have understood immediately, what took her years to fully perceive, was that the system had already been shaped around her before she arrived. The first jewels Camilla received access to came from the Queen Mother's collection. And on the surface, this seemed perfectly appropriate, even generous. The Queen Mother had assembled one of the most spectacular private jewelry collections of the 20th century. Pieces of extraordinary craftsmanship and historical significance. Among the items Camilla was directed toward were the Boucheron honeycomb tiara, a dramatic architectural piece that commanded attention in any room. She also had access to a series of large multi-strand pearl chokers fastened with oversized diamond clasps, the kind of statement pieces that photograph beautifully at formal receptions and state banquets. She wore them. She wore them well. And to any casual observer, she looked every inch the senior royal she now was. But inside the palace, among those who watched the Queen's decisions closely, something else was visible. The pieces Camilla had been given access to were all rooted in a specific era. The Queen Mother's aesthetic was magnificent but deliberately, unmistakably of the mid-20th century. Those pieces connected to a particular chapter of royal history, a closed chapter. Meanwhile, the pieces tied to the living identity of the monarchy, the pieces that appeared in current portraits and current state photographs and current diplomatic receptions, those pieces followed a different path entirely. They went to Catherine. When Catherine married William in April 2011, the world watched her walk down the aisle wearing the Cartier halo tiara, borrowed from the Queen's personal collection. The global reaction was exactly what the palace might have hoped: delight, admiration, a sense of genuine continuity between a beloved institution and a radiant young woman who seemed entirely at ease carrying its weight. And from that moment, something shifted in how the vault was managed. June 2021. The royal family gathered at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, to bury Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. The Duke had died on April 9, 99 years old, and the funeral was a moment of genuine national grief. The world's cameras pointed at that chapel with the intensity that only royal occasions of this magnitude can generate. And Catherine walked in wearing a 4-strand pearl choker that stopped every royal historian watching dead in their tracks. Those pearls had belonged to Diana. Specifically, they were the choker Diana had worn in November 1982 at the Hampton Court Palace banquet during the Dutch state visit, one of the earliest, most iconic images of the young Princess of Wales, radiant and magnetic in a way that the world had not quite expected and never forgot. The choker had gone into the vault after Diana's death in 1997. For nearly 24 years, no one had worn it. No one had been considered an appropriate custodian of what it represented. The Queen had just declared, in front of every camera on Earth, that Catherine was. Think about the precision of that decision for a moment. This was not a piece worn to a celebration or a diplomatic reception. This was a funeral, the most solemn, watched, emotionally charged royal occasion of recent years. The Queen had personally authorized Catherine's jewelry for that service, as was standard protocol. She had chosen Diana's pearls. She had placed them at the center of the most photographed moment of the year. And Camilla was sitting a few feet away. There is no diplomatic way to describe what that moment communicated. It was direct. It was deliberate. It was, in the vocabulary of royal symbolism, a complete sentence. Among the most significant pieces in the royal collection is the Nizam of Hyderabad necklace. It is a Cartier masterpiece, a geometric arrangement of brilliant diamonds set in platinum with a precision that, as several jewelry historians have noted, makes the piece look less like jewelry and more like architecture. It was given to the then Princess Elizabeth as a wedding gift in 1947 by the Nizam of Hyderabad, Mir Osman Ali Khan, who at the time was said to be among the wealthiest individuals in the world. The Queen wore it in several defining early portraits of her reign, images that appeared on currency, on stamps, in history books. The necklace became so thoroughly associated with the visual identity of young Queen Elizabeth II that it is essentially inseparable from our mental image of that era. For Camilla to wear this necklace would have been, symbolically, to wear the Queen's own face. Her own defining image. The visual cornerstone of the Elizabethan era. In 2014, The Queen authorized Catherine to wear the Nizam of Hyderabad necklace to an official gala. Catherine wore it. The photographs circulated internationally. And in that single evening, the Queen performed a transfer of visual prestige so enormous that it would take years for the full implications to fully register. She had taken the necklace that defined her own reign and placed it on the woman who would define the next one. She had not given it to the woman who was next in line to the title of Queen Consort. She had given it to the woman whose reign would matter longest, whose presence in the monarchy would stretch furthest into the future. This was not a fashion decision. It was a constitutional statement made in diamonds. Of all the pieces the Queen deployed in this long, quiet campaign, Queen Alexandra's wedding necklace may be the one that carried the most precisely targeted sting. Queen Alexandra received this diamond and pearl necklace as a wedding gift in 1863 when she married the future King Edward VII. From that moment forward, the piece became deeply associated with one thing above all others, the role of Princess of Wales. Alexandra had been Princess of Wales for 28 years before becoming Queen, and this necklace was worn throughout that period. It became, in the minds of those who track royal jewelry history, a piece tied fundamentally to that specific title. The same title, of course, that Camilla had been denied in 2005. The same title that still carried Diana's name burned into every syllable of it in the public imagination. After the Queen Mother died in 2002, the necklace passed to Queen Elizabeth II. And the Queen did something very particular with it. She put it in the vault and said nothing. Year after year of state banquets, formal receptions, and royal occasions passed. Camilla attended many of them. The necklace never came out for her. Then, in 2018, Catherine wore it to a state banquet at Buckingham Palace. The necklace tied to the Princess of Wales title. Worn by the actual Princess of Wales. At a formal state occasion. In the same room as Camilla. The Queen did not need to deliver a speech that night. She had made every point she intended to make, in pearls and diamonds, to an audience of hundreds who would not have missed the significance for a single moment. There are pieces of jewelry that speak to governments and pieces that speak to the heart. The Cambridge pearl brooch belongs in the second category, and the story of Camilla's attempt to borrow it, and the Queen's response, tells you more about the real nature of this conflict than almost anything else in this entire narrative. The brooch is not the most spectacular piece in the royal collection. It is not the most historically significant by the usual measures of diplomacy or state. What it is personal. The Queen wore it across 7 decades of her reign, to Christmas broadcasts, to quiet daytime engagements, to milestone portrait sittings. It was her daily companion, the piece that appeared more consistently across the full span of her reign than perhaps any other. It was, in the truest sense, a piece of the Queen herself. Not the formal, state occasion Queen. The everyday Queen. The woman behind the crown. Camilla asked, through appropriate channels, if she might borrow the brooch for an upcoming engagement. It was a reasonable request on paper. She was a senior royal, it was a standard engagement, the request was made politely and through the right people. The Queen smiled. The Queen said nothing. The Queen filed the request somewhere in the silence that she had learned to use as her most effective instrument. And the following year, Catherine wore the Cambridge pearl brooch in William and Catherine's first official joint portrait, unveiled in 2022. The portrait was widely distributed. It became one of the defining images of the next generation of the monarchy. And there, front and center on Catherine's chest, was the brooch that the Queen wore for 7 decades, now resting on the woman who would wear it for the next 7. Camilla's request had been answered. Not with a yes, not with a no, but with a portrait that would outlast everyone in this story. And then there is the piece that makes everything else look like prologue. The Edinburgh wedding bracelet is modest by the grand standards of the royal collection. Platinum, set with diamonds. Not theatrical. Not the kind of piece that fills a room from across it. But the story woven into those diamonds is one of the most affecting in the entire history of the royal family, and understanding it is essential to understanding why the Queen's decision about who received it says everything about who she actually trusted. Prince Philip's mother was Princess Alice of Battenberg. Her life was one of extraordinary suffering. In 1930, doctors who did not understand her condition, she is now believed by many medical historians to have been misdiagnosed, had her forcibly institutionalized. She was separated from her 5 children, including the young Philip, against her will. She spent years in institutions while her family was scattered across Europe by the upheavals of the early 20th century. She eventually renounced the material world entirely. She founded a Greek Orthodox nursing order, gave away everything she possessed, and spent her final years living at Buckingham Palace in a nun's habit, unbothered by status or possessions, carrying only her faith and her memories. Philip grew up knowing his mother's story, knowing what she had lost, knowing the kind of grief that gets buried quietly inside royal families and never spoken about because the institution demands composure before it permits honesty. When Philip was about to marry the woman who would become Queen Elizabeth II, he did something that reveals the entirety of who he was. He had his mother's tiara dismantled. He took it apart, piece by piece, and had its diamonds reset into a bracelet. A wedding gift for his bride. He was giving her the most intimate thing he possessed. A piece of his mother's suffering transformed by love into something the woman he had chosen could wear every day for the rest of her life. The Queen wore that bracelet for 73 years. And when she finally decided to share it, when she looked at every woman in that royal family and decided who was worthy of holding that history, she gave it to Catherine. Not to Camilla, who had been Charles's partner for decades, who was legally his wife, who sat at the same tables and attended the same ceremonies and carried the same senior royal title. To Catherine. Think about what that decision actually communicates. This is the most intimate object the Queen owned. The physical embodiment of her marriage. A piece born from a mother's institutionalized suffering and a young prince's need to transform that grief into love. The Queen looked at every woman available to her and decided that only one of them was the right custodian of that weight. There is no polite way to characterize what that decision said to Camilla. It was the clearest, most personal, most devastating statement the Queen ever made. And she made it without saying a single word. The Lover's Knot tiara was commissioned by Queen Mary in 1913. It is built from brilliant cut diamonds and 19 hanging pearls set in silver and gold. It is, by most accounts of those who have worn it, extraordinarily heavy for its size, a fact that Princess Diana herself confirmed on multiple occasions. Diana wore the Lover's Knot and complained it gave her headaches so severe that getting through a full evening required genuine effort. She wore it anyway. She wore it repeatedly. She wore it until it became so associated with her presence that it is almost impossible now to look at the tiara without feeling the ghost of who carried it. When Diana died, the tiara went back into the vault. The question of who would wear it next was one the Queen considered with great care. The wrong choice would have been read, correctly, as a desecration, a misunderstanding of everything the piece had come to mean and everything the public still felt about the woman who had made it iconic. The Queen gave it to Catherine. And in doing so, she completed an act of symbolic continuity that required no announcement and generated no official statement but communicated, with absolute clarity, something the palace had never needed to say out loud. The legacy of Diana, not the pain of the 1990s, not the collapse of her marriage, but the grace and the genuine public love she had inspired, would move forward through Catherine. Not around her. Not despite her. Through her. When Catherine wore the Lover's Knot, she did not look like a woman wearing borrowed jewelry. She looked like its rightful owner. Which was, of course, precisely what the Queen had intended. Queen Elizabeth II died on September 8, 2022, at Balmoral Castle. She was 96 years old. She had reigned for 70 years, longer than any British monarch in history. And the moment she was gone, every lock in that vault changed hands. Camilla, who had been managed and redirected and quietly denied for 17 years, now had unrestricted access to one of the greatest jewelry collections in human history. The leash was gone. The system built around her was gone. Angela Kelly had retired. The Queen who had drawn every line was gone. What Camilla did with that access is instructive. One of her first significant choices was the Greville Emerald Kokoshnik tiara, a piece of staggering visual power centered on a 93-carat emerald surrounded by a platinum lattice of diamonds. The tiara had been kept locked away for decades, not because of any shortage of suitable occasions, but because its origins were complicated. It had entered the royal collection in 1942 after being bequeathed by society hostess Dame Margaret Greville, and its provenance traces back through the upheaval of the early 20th century in ways that, as royal jewelry historians have noted, invite questions that the palace had long preferred to avoid. Queen Elizabeth II understood this. She had permitted the tiara to be worn once, at a private family wedding in 2018, far from the international scrutiny of a major diplomatic occasion. Camilla wore it to a significant diplomatic reception. Within hours, The commentary that followed was precisely the kind the Queen had spent decades carefully preventing. Questions about provenance, about aristocratic wealth, about the history of how certain objects moved between hands during periods of violent political upheaval. The Queen's protective caution, maintained for 70 years, had dissolved in a single evening. The response was not what Camilla had intended. Rather than reading her choice as a triumphant reclamation of denied access, observers read it as a demonstration of exactly the kind of judgment the Queen had apparently been concerned about all along. In March 2026, the Nigerian president visited Britain for a formal state banquet. It was a significant diplomatic occasion, the kind of event for which every piece of jewelry chosen carries weight and sends signals to an international audience that reads these signals fluently. Camilla arrived wearing multiple pieces simultaneously. The late Queen's personal Cartier bracelets stacked up her wrists. A towering sapphire tiara. Several layers of diamonds. It was, to any observer with knowledge of royal jewelry history, a display, an announcement of access, a visual catalogue of everything that had been denied and was now, finally, possessed. And then Catherine arrived. She wore one tiara. Just one. The lover's knot. She did not stack. She did not layer. She did not display. She simply walked into the room wearing the tiara that Diana had worn, the tiara the Queen had designated for her, the tiara that by now had accumulated 17 years of her own presence and grace inside its diamonds. Every camera turned. Not because Catherine had more jewelry on her body, she had far less. Not because she had made a louder entrance. But because when the lover's knot entered the room on Catherine's head, it brought something with it that Camilla's stacked bracelets and sapphire tiara simply could not generate. It brought the sense that this was exactly right. That this piece, on this woman, in this room, was where it was supposed to be. That the Queen who had understood all of this had understood it correctly. Camilla lost that room entirely. Completely. Instantly. Without a single word being exchanged. Here is the truth that this entire story has been building toward. Camilla now has access to everything. The vault is open. The system that was built around her is gone. There is no Angela Kelly logging requests. There is no Queen drawing quiet, permanent lines in the silence of her own deliberate decisions. She can request the lover's knot. She can request the pearl choker. She can request the Edinburgh wedding bracelet. There is no formal written designation protecting any of Catherine's access. The Queen never wrote it down. She communicated her intentions entirely through action, through the system she built over years, through the trust she extended without documentation to the woman she had chosen. Which means there is, technically, nothing on paper to stop Camilla from asking for any of it. But she won't. And the reason she won't is the same reason that 17 years of watching could not be reversed by 17 seconds of vault access. Because taking those pieces from Catherine would not give Camilla what those pieces actually carry. It would not give her the Queen's endorsement. It would not give her the private trust. It would not give her the pearl choker placed deliberately around her neck while the world watched and felt Diana's memory fill the room. It would not give her the bracelet built from a dead woman's suffering and a young prince's love. It would not give her any of it. It would only prove, in front of a global audience, that she is exactly the kind of woman who reaches for things that were never meant for her. She learned that lesson. She learned it slowly, and she learned it painfully, and she learned it in public over 17 years of Queen-authored silence. Queen Elizabeth II never gave a single speech about Camilla. She never issued a single formal statement about Catherine. She never sat either of them down and explained herself. She never had to. She spoke in diamonds. She spoke in pearls. She spoke in the Edinburgh wedding bracelet placed on Catherine's wrist, a bracelet built from a mother's tiara and a husband's love, now passed to the woman the Queen had decided was worthy of that weight. She spoke in the lover's knot, moved from a vault where it had sat in the shadow of Diana's memory into the hands of the woman who could carry that memory forward without being destroyed by it. She spoke in 17 years of open drawers and closed ones, of items presented to one woman and quietly denied to another, of a system so precisely constructed that it required no documents and no declarations because every action contained the declaration already.